Some crimes vanish, not in darkness, but in plain sight. This tale begins with a vanished lockbox on a lonely Oxfordshire road, where superstition whispered of a phantom lantern, and yet the truth concealed ropes, clay, and a cunning hand at work. Where are you tuning in from, and what time is it? Let me know in the comments. The path is set, the mystery waiting. Let us follow Holmes into the mist and uncover what lies beneath. It was upon an evening of peculiar tranquility that I found myself once more in our familiar sitting room at Baker Street, observing my friend Sherlock Holmes with that quiet fascination which his moods of concentration never failed to inspire. The rain had ceased after a long and dreary afternoon, leaving the air cool and moist. The lamps shone softly upon the bookshelves and the accoutrements of Holmes's peculiar craft, which lay scattered about the room in that disarray that was yet orderly to his trained perception. He had drawn his chair close to the fire, his long fingers steepled together, his hawk-like features illumined by the flickering glow. From time to time he muttered half-formed phrases, which I knew to be portions of some mental calculation. I had grown accustomed to such silences, and occupied myself with the medical journals that still commanded my interest. There was, however, a quality to Holmes's manner that evening, a settled calm, following upon days of unusual restlessness, which gave me cause to hope for a brief season of repose. Little did I suspect that, before the hour had closed, the stillness would be shattered by a case so strange, so audacious in its design, that it would demand the full measure of my companion's singular genius. Our peaceful vigil was broken by a sudden knock upon the outer door, hurried and almost desperate in its cadence. Mrs. Hudson ushered in a gentleman whose pallor and trembling frame bespoke a mind in acute distress. His attire was that of a respectable clerk, though travel-stained and disordered, as though he had, together with certain jewels consigned to a private firm. The iron chest was placed under my charge by the directors, and I had sealed it with my own hand before it was secured within the coach. I sat within, never losing sight of it, and I can swear before heaven that no man touched it from the moment it was placed there until we drew rein at Banbury Cross. And yet, when the coach was opened, gentlemen, the box was gone. His voice rose in agitation as he uttered the last words, and his fingers worked convulsively upon the arms of the chair. There was no sign of violence. The locks were intact, the panels unbroken. The very seals which I had affixed were found adhering, unbroken, to the interior of the coach. Yet the chest itself had vanished, as though spirited away by some infernal agency. I am undone, Mr. Holmes, unless you can bring light into this mystery. Holmes's eyes gleamed with quickened interest, though he uttered no word. My superiors are men of stern and unyielding temper, continued Henshaw, his voice sinking to a broken cadence. The responsibility was mine, and mine alone. If restitution be not made, I shall be dismissed in disgrace, and the savings of a lifetime will not suffice to repair the loss. Worse still, suspicion already points to me. They whisper that I contrived the disappearance, that I have secreted the treasure for my own enrichment. Sir, I swear upon my honour as a gentleman that I am innocent of such vile conduct, yet my protestations avail me nothing. Unless the truth be discovered, my name, my livelihood, and all I hold dear are ruined beyond recovery. Here he buried his face in his hands, and I confess that my heart was moved to pity for the wretched man. Holmes leaned forward, his gaze fixed upon our visitor with that penetrating intensity which few could withstand. Pray describe to me, Mr. Henshaw, the exact circumstances of the journey, said he. Who were your companions? Did aught occur which might seem trivial at the time, yet bears reconsideration in the light of this event? Thus pressed, the clerk recounted each stage of the journey, but Holmes's attention fastened upon the smallest details. He interrupted with sharp questions. What was the hour when you left the General Post Office? Did you observe aught unusual in the demeanour of the coachman? Were the horses disturbed? As Henshaw struggled to recall, Holmes's lips curled with that faint smile which I had learned to recognise as the prelude to some dawning illumination. "There is a precision in this affair, Watson," he murmured, half to himself, "that argues a mind of uncommon boldness and invention. Mark me, there is here the germ of a most singular stratagem." At this juncture, Henshaw hesitated, as though loath to impart some rumour for which he could vouch little. "There is one tale, Mr. Holmes, which I scarce dare repeat," he said. "It is whispered that during the darkest stretch of road, the coachman vanished from his seat for near 10 minutes, though he himself swears he never quitted the box. The horses went on as usual, and when challenged, he declared he had never stirred. Yet 2 passengers insist they saw the bench empty in the moonlight. It is madness, I grant you, but the story runs through the village like wildfire." Holmes's eyes narrowed, and he tapped his fingers lightly upon the arm of his chair. "Indeed, Watson," said he softly, "we have the promise of a case which may prove worthy of our steel." It was upon the following morning that Holmes and I set forth by train, and thence by carriage to the market town of Banbury Cross, near which the strange disappearance had occurred. The countryside lay draped in a thin, clinging mist that lent to a stretch of road, bordered by ragged hedges and flanked by a shallow ditch. "'Twas here, gentlemen," said he, pointing with his whip, "that the coach halted." Holmes sprang lightly to the ground and stood for several minutes in absorbed contemplation of the spot. The road lay silent, the mist creeping across it in ghostly drifts, and the very air seemed oppressed with a stillness unnatural to so frequented a thoroughfare. I confess that a chill ran down my spine as I surveyed the place, recalling Mr. Henshaw's tale of the vanished box and the rumours of a coachman who melted into the night. Holmes stooped, examining the ground with the quick, darting glances of a man accustomed to finding in trifles the clue to momentous issues. Yet the clay was trampled by many wheels, and no sign presented itself that my untrained eye could perceive. "Mark the silence, Watson," said he at last. "It is often in the quiet places that the boldest crimes are wrought." At a small inn upon the outskirts of the town, we encountered Inspector Gregson of Scotland Yard, who had been dispatched to take charge of the matter. He greeted us with that mixture of professional courtesy and latent rivalry, which so often characterized his dealings with Holmes. "You may save yourself the trouble, Mr. Holmes," said he with some complacency. "The case is as clear as daylight. Henshaw himself is at the bottom of it. Who else had both opportunity and motive? The directors will see it so, and I shall have him in custody before the week is out." Holmes listened with an air of polite indifference, though I could see that his keen intellect bristled at the inspector's crude conclusions. "Indeed," said he softly, "and yet you will admit that the disappearance of a locked iron chest, without mark or breakage, is scarcely the work of an amateur. Nay, Gregson, you may comfort yourself with theories, but I fear the true adversary lies beyond your reach." Gregson flushed but said nothing. For my part, I marvelled once more at the serene confidence with which Holmes set aside the facile explanations of others, his gaze fixed always upon the deeper, hidden currents that eluded the common eye. Holmes was soon engaged in a minute inspection of the mail coach itself, which had been drawn into a yard adjoining the inn. The heavy vehicle, with its stout panels and iron-bound doors, seemed in every respect secure against intrusion, and I confess that, despite my knowledge of Holmes's prowess, I could perceive no opening through which the lockbox might have been spirited away. Holmes, however, was not so easily baffled. He passed his delicate fingers over the hinges and fastenings, scrutinized the lock with a lens, and even rapped upon the timbers with his knuckles, listening intently to the hollow reverberations. At length he stooped, and his eye, quick as that of a hawk, detected a small but singular smear upon the floorboards. With a gloved finger he touched it lightly, and held it up for my examination. "It is clay, Watson," said he, "of a composition not common to these parts. I have observed a trace of the same upon Mr. Henshaw's garments. It is a trifle, no doubt, yet in such trifles the whole truth may often lie concealed." I saw Gregson glance impatiently, as if to dismiss the observation as trivial, but Holmes, unmoved, pocketed the sample with quiet satisfaction. The driver of the vehicle, a burly fellow by the name of Josiah Blake, was next summoned to give his account. His weather-beaten face and sturdy frame bespoke years of hard service upon the road. Yet a gaze, keen and unwavering, drifted from the man's face to his hands, which he clasped and unclasped nervously. Upon the broad palms I perceived, as did my companion, raw marks, such as might be left by the friction of cords. "You are sorely chafed, my good fellow," remarked Holmes quietly. "That is no common effect of rains." Blake coloured, thrusting his hands behind him with clumsy haste. "'Tis nothing, sir. The leather cuts one's grip, that is all." Holmes made no reply, but a faint smile flickered upon his lips as he turned away, leaving the man shifting uneasily from foot to foot. To my eyes it was but a trifle, yet I well knew that such trifles were to Holmes as signposts upon the highway. We retraced our steps to the place where the coach had halted. Holmes paced slowly to and fro, his eyes fixed upon the rutted surface of the road. At length he paused, stooping to examine the clay more closely. "Remark it, Watson," said he in a low tone. "There are the wheel marks of the coach itself. There the imprints of the horse's hooves. But beyond that, nothing. No trace of other wheels, no sign of pursuit or escape. And yet a chest of iron has vanished, as though the earth had swallowed it whole." I confess that a shiver passed through me at his words, for the desolation of the spot, combined with this inexplicable absence, imparted to the affair a flavour almost supernatural. Holmes straightened, his face thoughtful. "The earth has secrets, Watson, and it is my task to read them." Our journey ended in the little village which lay at the heart of the affair, a cluster of cottages gathered about a square, with the inevitable inn presiding over it. Holmes and I engaged a modest room therein, and I could not fail to remark upon the peculiar heaviness that seemed to rest upon the place. Men spoke in lowered voices, doors were shut more hastily than was their wont, and even the children, who should have been noisy in the lanes, played silently and glanced over their shoulders as if fearing some unseen watcher. Holmes was of his usual composed demeanour, though I observed that his eyes, ever quick to seize upon the least detail, moved from face to face with an alertness that suggested he found confirmation of his own private conjectures. For myself, I confess to an impression of unease. It seemed as if a shadow lay across the village, not of storm or season, but of some unwholesome fear. That this fear was linked to the mysterious disappearance upon the highway, none could doubt. Yet the precise form which their terror assumed was not immediately clear to me. Holmes, however, had already divined its nature. It was at the common room of the inn that the first whispers reached my ears. Two farmers, seated in the corner, spoke of a carriage which none had summoned and none had seen arrive, yet which had been observed upon the very stretch of road where the mail coach had vanished. "It came without sound," said one, crossing himself as he spoke, "and it passed as swiftly, leaving no mark behind it." Others, hearing the tale, nodded gravely, and one old woman declared that her grandmother had told of such a phantom long years ago, foretelling misfortune to those who beheld it. Holmes listened with an expression of detached interest, neither encouraging nor deriding their superstition. Yet when I ventured to dismiss it as the folly of ignorant rustics, he touched my arm. "You err, Watson," he murmured. "Such tales, however fantastic, often have their root in some material circumstance. It is our task to discern the solid fact beneath the vapour of superstition. The ghostly carriage may yet prove to be a very earthly contrivance." Thus he transformed idle gossip into a matter of grave importance, and I perceived that even the wildest rumours were to him no more than scattered fragments of a puzzle awaiting their due arrangement. Later that evening, Holmes contrived to draw into conversation the aged ostler of the inn, a bent and weather-worn fellow, whose years upon the road had made him privy to many a lantern upon the roadside. The pattern begins to emerge, though the picture is not yet complete. We must see what manner of men inhabit this village, for I suspect we shall find our answer among them. It was not long before our inquiries led us to the name of Hubert Staniforth, once the squire of a considerable estate, but now a man sorely reduced in fortune. His house, though still standing with a kind of faded dignity, was but the shell of its former splendour, and the man himself bore upon his features the marks of ruin and despair. "He is deep in debt," whispered the innkeeper's wife as she poured our ale. "The land is mortgaged, the tenants have fled, and there are those who say he traffics with smugglers along the coast to keep himself from starvation." Holmes contrived a meeting with the gentleman, and I was struck by the contrast between his bearing, which was proud and even haughty, and the threadbare garments which ill-concealed his poverty. His eye flashed with suppressed resentment when Holmes touched upon the robbery, and his replies were short, almost defiant. "Men will talk," said he coldly, "but I have no dealings with mail coaches, nor with lockboxes. If my enemies whisper otherwise, let them produce their proofs." Yet there was in his manner a nervousness ill-disguised, and Holmes, while treating him with courtesy, observed him with a scrutiny that seemed to penetrate to his inmost thoughts. As we left, my companion remarked quietly, "Here, Watson, is a man upon whom misfortune presses heavily. Whether he be victim or villain, we shall soon determine." It was later, as we sat in the common room, that a timid voice drew Holmes's attention. The inn's barmaid, a young woman of modest appearance, lingered near our table under the pretence of clearing the mugs. Her eyes darted fearfully toward the landlord, who busied himself at the far end, before she bent closer. "Beg pardon, sir," she whispered, "but I thought you ought to know what I heard yesternight. 'Twas Mr. Staniforth, and he was speaking with the coachman, Blake. They thought themselves alone in the passage, but I was in the scullery, and the words carried. Mr. Staniforth was in a rage, saying, 'The timing must be exact, else all is lost.' And Blake answered back, 'The signals will be ready, and you'll have naught to fear.' Her voice trembled as she recounted this, and she cast anxious glances about her. 'I dared not tell the constables,' she continued, 'for fear they'd laugh at me, or worse. But you look like gentlemen who can judge rightly.' Holmes inclined his head gravely, bidding her say no more. Yet, when she had withdrawn, he exchanged with me a glance which spoke volumes. The net, it seemed, was drawing tighter about both the ruined landowner and the uneasy coachman. That night, after the barmaid's revelation, Holmes appeared sunk in a contemplative humour. He paced the length of our chamber, his brows knit, and his lips moving silently, as though rehearsing a chain of reasoning invisible to any save himself. I ventured at last to probe him. "Surely, Holmes, this points unmistakably towards Staniforth, the quarrel, his debts, his proximity to the scene. Surely he is the architect of the affair." Holmes paused, fixing me with that half-amused, half-compassionate expression he so often assumed when I leapt to conclusions. "You reason bravely, Watson. Yet you reason like the world at large. Upon the surface, there is an order in these events which the casual eye overlooks. I have gathered testimony from farmers, ostlers, and now a barmaid. Each speaks truly, yet each is but a fragment of the whole. To him who can fit them together, the picture becomes plain." "But you already see it," I cried. He smiled faintly. "I begin to suspect the outline, though not yet the colour. Patience, my dear fellow, patience. The hour is not yet ripe for good," said he simply. "The nearer we approach the truth, the louder will bark the watchdogs of falsehood. Sleep well, Watson, for we shall need our wits upon the morrow." His calmness steadied my own nerves, yet I could not banish from my mind the sinister image of that unseen hand at our very door. On the following morning, Holmes expressed his desire that we should pay a call upon Hubert Staniforth at his estate, which lay but a short walk from the village. I confess I was curious to behold the dwelling of one who had been so freely spoken of as a ruined man, and who, by the barmaid's testimony, stood in close understanding with Josiah Blake. The house we approached bore upon it the unmistakable stamp of decay. Once it must have been a fair seat, with broad lawns and stately avenues, but the hedges were untrimmed, the windows darkened, and the stonework scarred with neglect. A silence, heavy and oppressive, seemed to brood upon the place, and I could not but reflect that the home was but a mirror of its master's fallen fortunes. Staniforth himself received us with a mixture of hauteur and bitterness. His figure was spare, his features worn, yet there lingered about him an air of pride that neither debt nor gossip had wholly crushed. Holmes, with his customary courtesy, made some inquiry touching the robbery, but the squire's replies were curt, almost resentful, and I fancied his eye strayed more than once toward the ground, as if he feared some disclosure. When at last we withdrew, Holmes murmured, "A proud man struggling in the toils of ruin, Watson. There is tragedy here, though whether of his own making or another's hand, we must presently determine." As we quitted the house, Holmes's attention was drawn to a low range of buildings that stood somewhat apart from the main dwelling. With characteristic directness, he made his way thither, and we soon found ourselves within what had once been a stable. Dust and cobwebs lay thick upon the beams, and the air carried the odour of long disuse. Yet to Holmes's eye, even such desolation bore its testimony. He moved swiftly about the place, peering into corners and brushing away the debris with his stick. Presently he stooped, and from the straw upon the floor lifted a length of leather harness, cracked but of unmistakably foreign make. "Spanish," said he briefly, "a curious possession for a country squire whose stables have long stood empty." More startling still was the patch of clay which he next displayed to my astonished gaze. It clung to the floorboards, dull and heavy, of that peculiar consistency which I recalled from the coach itself. Holmes gathered a sample into his handkerchief and tucked it away with the same air of quiet satisfaction I had seen before. "Note it well, Watson," said he. "Here we have the clay, and here the harness of alien workmanship. These are not the relics of poverty, but of a plan carried forward with some skill. The house of Staniforth conceals more than mere debt and despair." It was scarcely an hour later, while we lingered still in the village, that the most startling turn of all befell. A boy came running breathless through the street, crying that there had been a dreadful deed at the manor. We hastened back with the villagers, and there, in a sombre chamber lined with faded books, lay the lifeless form of Hubert Staniforth. His throat had been cut from ear to ear, and the weapon rested loosely in his hand. Upon the desk before him was a sheet of paper, blotched and trembling in its characters, purporting to confess his guilt in the robbery and to declare his despair. The constables, with Gregson at their head, seized upon this with avidity, and the inspector lost no time in proclaiming the advantage. He planted himself squarely in the centre of the chamber, his arms folded with an air of triumph, and announced to all assembled that the affair had reached its conclusion. "You see it plain as I do, gentlemen," cried he. "Here lies the thief, overcome by the weight of his guilt. Ruined in purse, dishonoured in name, he contrives this desperate scheme, only to find himself driven by remorse to the final act. With this note before us, and the weapon still in his hand, who can doubt it?" Several of the constables murmured assent, while the villagers, who had crowded into the hall, shook their heads sorrowfully, as though convinced of the justice of his words. Even Mr. Henshaw, when he was summoned, seemed disposed to accept the verdict, so utterly did the scene conform to the picture of despair. But Holmes, who had remained motionless by the escritoire, now raised his head with a look of quiet irony. "It is indeed a convincing tableau, Gregson," said he. so convincing that one must wonder at the artifice employed in arranging it. I shall be curious to learn how you reconcile these appearances with certain trifling details that have come under my notice. The inspector flushed, but made no reply, while I observed that Holmes's gaze never once wavered from the lifeless figure in the chair. Holmes stepped forward, lifting the paper delicately from the desk between finger and thumb. He held it close to the light, his eyes narrowing with concentrated scrutiny. "Observe, Watson," said he at length, "the penmanship. You have seen Staniforth's hand upon former documents in his study, have you not?" I assented, recalling the neat, sloping script upon certain receipts and letters. "Compare it with this," continued Holmes, laying the supposed confession beside them. "Note how the strokes here are laboured and uneven, betraying not the flowing hand of habit, but the constrained effort of imitation. Moreover, the ink is still fresh. I should judge it not an hour old. Yet, the body is cold enough to show that death came long before. There is here a discrepancy which even the dullest of observers must allow." Gregson made some impatient gesture, but Holmes proceeded inexorably. "Again, consider the weapon. It lies loosely in the hand, but mark the rigidity of the fingers. In genuine suicide, the grasp remains convulsive, and the blade is found clutched with terrible tenacity. Here, on the contrary, it has been posed with theatrical precision." I shuddered at the words, for the evidence once pointed out admitted of no denial. A dreadful certainty stole over me that we stood not in the presence of self-destruction, but of murder cunningly masked. Holmes replaced the papers with meticulous care. "Believe me, Gregson, the man we seek walks yet abroad, and it would be folly indeed to rest content with this hollow explanation." Holmes next directed our attention to a detail so slight that I had not thought it worthy of remark. Stooping, he pointed to the carpet near the chair, where several small globules of wax lay hardened against the fibres. "Now, Watson," said he, "what strikes you here?" I confessed that I perceived nothing beyond the obvious fact that a candle had been permitted to drip. "Precisely," he answered. "But recall the habits of the deceased. We have been assured, both by the servants and by our own observation, that Staniforth invariably employed lamps fed with oil. Indeed, there is not in the house, so far as I have seen, a single candlestick fit for use. Yet here we have wax newly spilt, and upon the very night of his death. What conclusion follows?" That a note of dread, as though it waited for some further calamity to fall, Holmes broke the silence with a tone of quiet authority. "Mark it well, Watson. This is no ending, but the beginning of the true pursuit. The hand that slew Staniforth moves still, and with growing desperation. Each step brings him nearer to exposure, and us nearer to the heart of the design. The more cunning the disguise, the more fatal the flaw that betrays it. I knew then, with chilling certainty, that the danger was far from past, and that the unseen adversary would strike again before the case reached its close. The following day Holmes summoned me early, his eyes gleaming with that peculiar fire which told me his mind was fixed upon a definite course. "Watson," said he, "the time for conjecture is over. We must now pass from theory to experiment. Our adversary, emboldened by Staniforth's death, will not rest content. He believes his design secure, yet I have reason to think he will attempt a second stroke to confirm his triumph. We shall provide him with the opportunity and the snare." He then unfolded his plan with that crisp precision which always impressed me. A coach, similar in every particular to the one employed in the fateful journey, was to set forth that very night along the same road. The word had been spread that it bore a second consignment of valuables, though in truth the chest would be but a harmless counterfeit. Into this contrivance Holmes and I should enter, disguised as clerks in charge of the delivery. Meanwhile, a detachment of constables would lie hidden at intervals along the route, ready at a signal to close upon the marauders. "It is a bold venture," I observed, but fraught with peril. Holmes smiled faintly. My dear fellow, when one would trap a cunning beast, one must bait the snare with courage as well as craft. I promise you the play will be worth the candle. Thus resolved, he set himself to the necessary preparations with a calmness which left me alternately in admiration and in dread. Holmes possessed an art in disguise which never ceased to astonish me. By the evening, a transformation had rendered him unrecognizable even to my practiced eye. His quick intelligence, usually stamped upon his keen features, was now masked beneath the stolid expression of a commonplace clerk. His sharp lines softened, his posture altered, his voice subdued into a flat monotone. For myself, he contrived a humbler garb, in which I felt sufficiently awkward, though his encouragement lent me confidence. The counterfeit lockbox was placed beneath the seat of the coach, and I had the satisfaction of noting that it resembled in weight and appearance the original. Holmes inspected every fastening, every hinge, with the same meticulous attention he had bestowed upon the stolen chest, and when he was satisfied, he gave a brief nod. Meanwhile, Inspector Gregson had posted his men at intervals along the lonely stretch of road where the first disappearance had taken place. They lay in concealment among the hedges and ditches, instructed to await the signal of Holmes's whistle before closing in. The arrangements were made with such secrecy that only those immediately concerned had knowledge of the stratagem. At length, all was in readiness. As the lamps of the coach were lit and the horses harnessed, Holmes turned to me. "You have often accompanied me into danger, Watson, but never into one more strange than this. Tonight we shall meet our adversary face to face, and his ingenuity shall be matched against ours." With that, we mounted to our places within the vehicle, and the wheels began to roll toward the scene of destiny. It was close upon midnight when we reached the fateful stretch of road. The mist had risen again, drifting across the fields in long white shrouds, and the moon broke fitfully through rifts in the cloud. The rhythmic beat of the horses' hooves and the creak of the coach became the only sounds in that desolate. Just as my heart had settled into the dull rhythm of suspense, the first sign appeared. Without warning, a flare of light burst upon the darkness, a pale, ghostly lantern raised high upon the roadside. It glowed with an unearthly brilliance, casting long, wavering beams across the mist, and for an instant the horses plunged wildly, snorting in terror as though some spectre barred their way. Blake's tale recurred to me with startling vividness. Here, indeed, was the phantom light that had so dismayed him and given birth to rumours of witchcraft and spirits. I grasped the side of the coach to steady myself, my pulse racing with the uncanny aspect of the scene. Holmes, however, uttered a low exclamation of satisfaction. "As I foretold, Watson, the signal is given. Now let us see the mechanism by which our phantom seeks to ensnare us." Even as he spoke, I felt a jolt beneath us, as though the very road had shifted. The horses, still rearing, were dragged sharply aside, and the coach lurched upon its springs with a violence that nearly flung me from my seat. It was as if some hidden force had seized the vehicle, drawing it toward the ditch. In that instant, masked figures sprang from the hedge, rushing upon us with cries that rang out through the night. The snare had closed, but whether upon them or upon us was yet to be determined. The sudden lurch of the coach was unlike anything I had ever experienced. It was no natural swerving of frightened animals, but a violent wrench, as though unseen hands beneath the very earth had dragged us bodily from our course. The horses, snorting in terror, were pulled sideways, their hooves striking sparks from the stones as they fought against the invisible force. In that instant, the secret of Blake's phantom carriage stood revealed before me, though I could scarce comprehend its mechanics. The road itself seemed treacherous, bound with some contrivance hidden beneath the soil, and we were caught fast in its grip. Out of the hedges leapt half a dozen masked men, their cloaks flying, their cries sharp upon the night. One seized the reins, another clambered toward the door, while the rest spread themselves as though to surround and overpower us. Their movements were swift, coordinated, and bore the stamp of long rehearsal. I heard Holmes's low voice at my side. "Courage, Watson. The play is about to begin." His calmness steadied my nerves, even as the tumult swirled around us. For though the snare had been sprung upon us, I knew that we were ourselves the bait, and that Holmes's foresight had placed stronger forces in readiness. At Holmes's whistle, shrill and piercing, the darkness seemed to burst into sudden life. From ditch and hedge rose the constables, their lanterns flaring, their batons gleaming. The robbers, taken unawares, found themselves assailed from every side, and a furious struggle ensued upon the lonely road. Blows fell thick and fast, the clash of iron against wood echoing across the fields. One fellow sought to escape, but was hurled to the ground by two officers who flung themselves upon him with practiced precision. Another grappled with me at the coach door. We struggled fiercely, and though my strength is not inconsiderable, I might have fared ill had not Holmes himself struck the man aside with a sudden blow that sent him reeling. The air was filled with shouts, curses, and the trampling of feet. Yet above it all rang Holmes's clear commands, directing the constables like a general upon the field. "Guard the horses! Cut him off! This way, lads, this way!" In a matter of minutes the balance had turned. Several of the marauders lay bound upon the ground. Others fled vainly into the night, only to be overtaken and secured. The coach, though shaken, stood firm, and I drew a deep breath of relief. Yet Holmes, his gaze intent, seemed to look still for one figure who had not yet shown his face. Amidst the confusion, a tall figure pressed through the attention to the contrivance which had effected the robbery. Beneath the very road, cunningly concealed by earth and brushwood, ran a system of ropes and wheels, worked from a pit cunningly dug at the roadside. By pulling at the hidden cords, Blake and his accomplices could jerk the coach aside with irresistible force, simulating the panic of frightened horses, while leaving no trace of other wheels or hoofs upon the clay. "The phantom carriage of the villagers," Holmes explained, "was but this lantern, raised to startle the beasts and mask the moment of diversion. Once the coach was diverted, the lockbox was swiftly removed through the door and the road restored to its former aspect before dawn." Ingenious, Watson. Diabolically so. Yet in all such devices lies a fatal vanity. The criminal, having once succeeded, cannot resist the temptation to strike again. And therein lies his downfall. As Holmes spoke, Blake, who had been held in the grasp of two constables, wrenched himself free with the fury of despair. With a snarl, he sprang forward, a knife flashing in his hand, and hurled himself straight upon my companion. I cried out in horror, but Holmes, though taken aback, did not flinch. The blade was already descending when instinct drove me to fling myself between them. My arm caught his, and together we crashed to the ground, the knife flying from his grasp. The officers were upon him in an instant, forcing him back with blows that left him stunned and helpless. Holmes raised me gently, his face pale but composed. "Once again, Watson," said he, with that quiet smile I knew so well, "I find my debt to you heavier than I can repay." Thus ended the most perilous moment of that night's adventure. Our return to London was accomplished without incident, though I confess that seldom have I welcomed the sight of the familiar murky skyline with such heartfelt relief. After the brooding stillness of the Oxfordshire lanes, haunted by rumours of phantoms and dark conspiracies, Baker Street seemed by contrast a very haven of security. Even the clamour of the traffic, the cries of the newspaper boys, and the clatter of the hansom cabs came to me with the sound of reassurance, as though civilization itself had closed its ranks about us. Holmes was in one of his most meditative moods during our journey. He spoke little, save to utter now and again some fragment of thought which bore no immediate meaning to me. Yet his eyes shone with that inward light which I had come to recognize as the herald of a masterly explanation. It was not until we were once more ensconced in our familiar sitting room, with the fog rolling against the panes and the fire casting its ruddy glow upon Holmes's lean features, that he turned to me with his accustomed composure. "And now, Watson," said he, "we may at last unravel the tangled skein, and show how each thread, however dark, fits into its appointed place." Thus, after days of suspense and peril, the hour of illumination was at hand. Holmes began with that small but significant clue which he had noted upon the floor of the coach and again within the abandoned stable. "You recall, Watson," said he, "the smear of clay which clung to the boards. That clay was of a peculiar consistency, dense, adhesive, and tinged with mineral elements uncommon to the district. My suspicions were confirmed when I discovered a deposit of the same material upon the stable floor at Staniforth's estate. The explanation is this. Beneath the roadside where the coach was diverted lay a concealed chamber, excavated and shored with timbers. It was into this pit that Blake and his confederates descended, working unseen by those above. The clay was disturbed and brought to the surface upon their boots and ropes, leading to superstition. Such an apparition was enough to conjure spirits from the mist. But to the practiced eye, it bore the unmistakable stamp of human contrivance. The ostler spoke of a tall man waiting by the hedge with a lantern. He saw truly, though he failed to grasp its significance. That man was none other than Blake himself, or one of his immediate associates, arranging the very mechanism that was to ensnare the coach. "It is an old trick, Watson," Holmes added with a faint smile. "Mountebanks and showmen have long employed such lights to work upon the imagination of the credulous. Blake merely adapted the device to his own darker purpose. Thus the phantom carriage was nothing more than a ghost conjured by a thief's lantern." I could not but admire the simplicity of the explanation, which dissipated in an instant the mists of superstition that had so enshrouded the case. Holmes then turned to the fate of the unhappy squire, whose tragic end had cast so sombre a shadow upon the whole affair. "You will recall, Watson," said he, "that suspicion was directed towards Staniforth by reason of his debts, his reputed dealings with smugglers, and the overheard quarrel with Blake. These appearances, carefully contrived, were intended to point the finger of justice away from the true culprit. In reality, Staniforth was but a convenient scapegoat. His poverty and his pride made him the perfect victim. The counterfeit confession, written in an unpracticed hand, and the knife placed loosely within his fingers, were but the finishing touches to a scene designed to deceive the casual eye. Add to this the rumours artfully spread in the village, and the web was complete." Holmes's voice grew grave as he continued. The poor man was lured into a position from which he could not escape. When he proved less pliant than they wished, he was silenced with ruthless hand, his death masquerading as suicide. Thus the innocent were branded guilty, and the guilty went free, until their own vanity betrayed them. I confess that a pang of sorrow struck me as I reflected upon the lonely figure of Hubert Staniforth, ruined in fortune, misjudged in life, and murdered in death. Yet I was consoled that through Holmes's genius, his name would be cleared and his honour vindicated. Holmes leaned back in his chair, his long fingers steepled before him, and regarded me with that quiet satisfaction which comes to him when the last piece of a puzzle has been placed. "You will remember, Watson," said he, "the curious abrasions I noted upon Blake's palms when we first interviewed him. He explained them away as the natural consequence of handling his reins. Yet the pattern of those burns was inconsistent with such an origin. They were deeper, more symmetrical, and bore the unmistakable stamp of sustained friction against coarse rope." He paused, allowing the image to settle in my mind before continuing. The truth was that Blake, while feigning control of his team, was in fact manipulating the ropes of the subterranean contrivance. With one hand he guided the horses, With the other, he hauled upon the cords that jerked the coach from its course. Thus his hands betrayed him more surely than his tongue. For a man may school his voice, but not the silent testimony of his flesh. I marvelled at the simplicity of the deduction, and yet, as always, it appeared inevitable once stated. Holmes's countenance softened into that faint smile, which I had seen upon it after many a successful venture. "You perceive now, Watson," said he, "the value of our stratagem. By contriving a second delivery, we supplied the criminal with the very temptation his vanity demanded. Convinced that fortune had favoured him once, he could not resist repeating his exploit. At length he spoke, and his tone had in it a gravity which impressed itself upon my memory. There is, Watson, a curious psychology to crime. Men will risk their lives for gold, yet it is not always the gold which lures them most strongly. Vanity, pride, and the intoxication of success drive them further than mere necessity ever could. Blake had secured a fortune in bonds and jewels. Prudence would have counselled flight. Yet he lingered, contrived a second attempt, and so brought the net upon himself. He tapped the arm of his chair with emphasis. Mark this well. The true criminal is never content with one triumph. He longs to savour his craft, to prove his cleverness once more, to stand as master over those he deems blind and witless. But therein lies his ruin. For the more intricate the deception, the greater the flaw which betrays it. Vanity, Watson, vanity. It is the cracked stone in the foundation of every criminal edifice. I nodded, struck by the sombre wisdom of his words. As I took up my pen to record these events, I found my thoughts dwelling less upon the villain unmasked than upon the genius who had exposed him. Again and again I marvelled at the unerring eye, the swift deduction, and the calm courage which had transformed a web of phantoms into a tale of ropes, clay, and lanterns. Yet for all Holmes's triumph, I could not wholly banish from my mind the image of Hubert Staniforth, ruined and misjudged, his lonely death staged to serve another's purpose. It seemed to me that even justice, stern and relentless, could not restore the dignity so cruelly torn from him. And when my thoughts turned to that eerie road, with its misty hedges and its sudden flare of ghostly light, I felt again the chill of that midnight ride. The lantern, once a trick of villainy, lingered in my imagination as a symbol of human credulity, the frailty by which cunning preys upon the unwary. Holmes, perceiving my abstraction, laid his hand upon my arm. "Do not dwell over long upon the shadows, Watson," said he gently. "It is enough that we have brought truth to light." And so the matter closed, leaving me with fresh admiration for my friend, and with a memory of the phantom lantern that will haunt me to my dying day. Holmes leaned back in his chair, the firelight glinting upon his sharp features, and spoke with that quiet gravity which lent his words the weight of judgment. "Observe, Watson, it was not the mechanism of ropes and pulleys that brought Blake to ruin, but the vanity which compelled him to strike again. Greed blinded him, but pride sealed his fate. The most elaborate device cannot save a man from the simplest flaw of character." And so, dear listener, a question remains. What do you think was Blake's gravest miscalculation? His ingenious contrivance beneath the road, or his insatiable desire to prove his cleverness once more? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if this mystery stirred your imagination, do remember to subscribe for more tales of Holmes's unmatched deductions, and share this story with friends who savour a good puzzle.